morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamara Ecker, Managing Director of British American Business, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's session discussing the growing importance of ethical and sustainable supply chains for your business. It's not only an issue that is critical to our environment, but also to ensure competitive access for diverse suppliers. Our conversation today will broadly focus on three buckets of diversity, reporting, I believe with a particular focus on scope 3, and also investment. Today's session is part of BAB's Corporate Citizenship and Sustainability Series. We like to say CCSS, it's a bit of a tongue twister, which consists of a mixture of roundtables and business intelligence briefings covering environmental, social, and governance issues across business and private sector-led initiatives. This series has actually become a pretty central line of programming for BAB, and that is thanks in large part to our sponsors, who are Debevoise and Plimpton, EY, and United Airlines. And I know we have some representative speakers today from those companies. In terms of our format for today, we are going to kick off with a moderated discussion for about 35 minutes with our guest speakers. And then for the remainder of the time, we will open the discussion to questions from you, our audience. Please keep your microphones on mute. If you please do keep your cameras on. This session is meant to be interactive, so please do use the raise your hand feature if you'd like to ask a question, and we will come to you and you could ask your question live to the group. So to help us tackle this topic and lead us through today's discussion, we're very lucky to be joined by a fantastic panel of experts who will be moderated by another expert, Joe Holman, ESG practice leader at Witham, which is an accounting and advisory firm. Joe has 25 years of experience in financial services, including providing ESG integration, monitoring, and support services for investment managers and operating companies. Before joining Witham, Joe founded an ESG advisory firm, a PRI signatory, and worked with credit, real estate, private equity, and hedge funds. So we are in very good hands. Joe, welcome, and over to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the kind words in the introduction. So yeah, today's topic is going to be on creating long-term impact and driving business transformation through diverse, ethical, and sustainable supply chains, which is a lot to say, a lot of words in there. But today's presentation, we want to discuss the importance of considering supply chain risk beyond the highly publicized issues of shortages of critical materials. So now we all talked about the critical material shortages during COVID-19. We knew how it took a year longer to get what we were looking to buy. We knew about the backup of ships in LA Harbor, but what wasn't really talked about was how the people were treated in terms of creating those supplies that were backed up, that were being not delivered in time for our usage. So today's presentation, we're going to go into looking at how suppliers look at diversity, ethical, and sustainable supply chain, or their own operations, I should say, and how it's pushed down by corporations. So for B2B suppliers on the call today, I want you to understand the importance of understanding what your customers think of when they think of corporate social responsibility and how they're pushing it down upon you as their supplier. So by understanding those corporate requirements or those policies and procedures, you're going to actually can give yourself a leg up on the competition. You'll also probably make yourself a better company and a much more sustainable company. So it's sort of a win-win for everybody. You'll have a better appearance to your customers, and you'll have a better business operation. So with that said, today's topics obviously are going to be on DEI, human rights, sustainability, and preference risks and verifications. And that's how I broke up today's presentation. And our speakers, we have a great lineup of speakers. As was said, we're looking at a buyer, an investment manager, and a consultant for ESG. So Ashim Jain is the Director and Strategic Sourcing and Supply Management person at United Airlines. We have Siobhan Archer, who's a Sustainability Investment Specialist at LGT Wealth. and Lauren Rogue, who's a partner and specialist in supply chain transformation at E&Y. So to begin with, I'd like each of our speakers to kind of introduce themselves a little bit, tell us about their background and what you do at your company, and where you're based, because I think where you're based actually says a lot about how you look at ESG. So Ashima, would you like to begin to tell me a little about what a strategic supply management function is at United?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Joe. First of all, thanks to BAB for inviting United Airlines and myself to talk about this topic. United is very passionate about all things DEI. Particularly my role, I am the leader for all things third-party spend analytics and what we do as we call it strategic supplier management. At United Airlines. I'm part of the global procurement organization. I've been based out of Chicago, where our corporate service center is. And I've been with United for 9 years, over 9 years now. And prior to that, I was a procurement consultant. So that's a short about me.
Okay. Siobhan, you're the sustainability investment specialist at LGT Wealth. How does social conscious supply chain fit into what your investment process and your job function? So if you want to tell me a little about your background and what you do, and if you can follow up with that information.
Absolutely. And I have to apologize. The lights will go off in the background because I'm not moving in this room. But thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. I work as a sustainable investment specialist for LGT Wealth Management. So we are a UK based, and I'm based in London myself, wealth manager, which offers tailored solutions to clients and investors that have personal or financial links to the US. We're part of a larger bank, an international bank called LGT, which is owned by the princely family of Liechtenstein. And the reason I bring that up is because that family's been around for 900 years. So they have quite an interesting long-term perspective on sustainability. Our chairman has made a commitment to net zero by 2030. So we have sort of quite a long-term vision of what we consider climate change and these social issues to be. We also have a venture philanthropy arm. So really thinking about how we can include people in the transition as I get darker.
Okay, well, that's all right. That's very energy conscious of you.
En majuscule, BTB.
Lauren, how about yourself? Do you want to tell us a little about your background?
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and likewise, such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So as you mentioned, I'm a partner in EY's climate change and sustainability services team. So I work with a range of clients across a range of sectors, although primarily consumer and financial services, basically helping them to navigate the sort of shifting landscape of sustainability and ESG with a particular and sort of continued changing stakeholder expectations to help them sort of prioritize what the most important issues are and help them to develop strategies to address them. And I spent quite a bit of my time at EY also in our supply chain procurement consulting team as well. So I sort of most of my work focuses on bringing together the sustainable supply chain factors. And in that really, I tend to focus on the S side. So, the human rights, ethics, diversity type issues. Yeah, and I'm based in New York.
Okay, great. Ashima, can you talk about, so you're a supply chain specialist or a strategic supply management function at United. Can you tell me a little about some of the strategic initiatives that you're overseeing at United?
So for strategic supplier management, we have United has already committed, and it's public news, that we want to be part of the $1 billion roundtable. So at least have at least $1 billion of spend with third-party suppliers that are certified by agencies that are recognized by BDR. And it could be in the 5 areas: the minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, LGBTQ, disability, and veteran-owned businesses. So that's a commitment that United has already made, and we are feverishly working towards that commitment. To achieve that goal, in the next 3 years, we have laid out or started several initiatives. And we are working like at a business division level and it's a very data-driven exercise where we are looking at our data constantly, tracking what our current spend is with the diverse and small businesses, what their certifications are, etc. Working with the affiliate partners to get as much access to diverse and small businesses for our supply chain needs. We are also incorporating a very strong tier 2 diverse supplier program by having very solid questionnaires around diversity through our RFP processes, having very strong language in our contracts with all our suppliers about their commitment to supplier diversity in their supply chains. Biggest focus is on being this very transparent and data-driven exercise. So those are the key areas we're working on.
Now, a lot of that you mentioned, though, are US focused in terms of minority certification. Gender certification, I believe, is a US concept. So the $1 billion spend is really focused on procurements out of the United States.
Yes. However, BDR also recognizes, there's an agency in the UK as well. If anybody is certified by that particular agency in the UK as a minority-owned business, BDR also recognizes that.
Okay.
So yeah, so those would be the 2 markets where we are focused on.
Okay, and that probably excludes like Southeast Asia and Africa, I would imagine, to some extent. All right, interesting. Siobhan, so you're a sustainability investment specialist. There's a lot of S's in this conversation today. So at LGW Wealth. So what does that mean, and how do you incorporate social conscious supply chain fit into the investment process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's been quite a few drivers pushing us to really look at the S. The first, and all of you will be familiar with this, is regulation. So from the 2017 French law of vigilance to more recently, just last year, Germany has now made it a mandatory requirement for all companies to be doing human rights due diligence in their supply chains, to everything the EU is doing on CSSS, which I think is the corporate social sustainability due diligence disclosure law. Somebody correct me if that's not right. Straight to right now, the SEC is working on a human capital management rulemaking. And I know that I was going to say last year, it's now 2 years ago, we're in 2023 and 21. Joe Biden put through the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, banning the import of many of those solar panels and products made in that region. So really, regulation is pushing us in one direction. On the risk side, and I won't speak too much about this because I know we'll cover it off later, but on the risk side, as investment managers, we're one step removed even from the companies and their supply chains. So really what's key for us is reporting, transparency, more data, all of the classics. But out of all of those drivers, I think the most important one, given that we're sort of responsible investors, is this notion of the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. So us as investors have now committed, and many of us do have this duty to abide by the 3-part framework of the UN guiding principles. The first being a strong policy commitment, which we spent the last year developing, and we just put out our policy, I think, just about November of last year. So really coming together and saying, what does it mean to have a policy commitment to uphold human rights for our investment process and for, of course, all of our supplier contracts. The second, and this is really what's most relevant to today's call, is having that strong due diligence process. And this is something that I think we're always going to be working on. And Lauren and Ashima will know much better than me exactly how this works in practice. But for us, it's data points, it's really contacting both fund managers and companies on a regular basis. It's looking out for the data points that aren't easy to measure, and that's the classic case with anything on the social spectrum. And then finally, it's providing access to remedy, which for me, I lead our stewardship efforts, so our engagement and our voting here, and that's really where we're able to start putting that into practice.
Okay, and you're also a PRI signatory, I understand.
We are. So we have been a PRI signatory since 2008.
And for people that don't know what a PRI signatory is, it means that the investment manager subscribes to 6 principles. And as of today, it's advertised by PRI that half the world's capital, over $100 trillion, uses these 6 principles of socially responsible investing when doing their portfolio investing. So FYI. Lauren, so now you're on the sell side. So you're kind of different than Siobhan, who is investing in companies. Ashima is making the purchases. You're advising clients. Who are the majority of your clients, and how do you advise them on socially supply chain transformation? And again, the S's are just killing me.
So I work with mostly sort of larger Fortune 500 US companies. And then in working with them, often have a lot of engagement with their suppliers, which may often be sort of smaller entities. And as I mentioned, usually my focus is on the consumer, retail, and financial services sector, but I've worked across probably all the sectors. And I think the approach that I would say to take to social supply chain transformation is the same, sort of regardless of the sector, that you need to start with a really good understanding of well, I think you start with the policy commitment per Siobhan's point, but then a really good understanding of what your main social, or whether you're looking at it more broadly from a sustainability standpoint, issues are, because I think there's a bit of a pitfall to start with just I'm going to reach out to my suppliers and send them a big survey asking them a million questions, but you really want to start with understanding where the risk is, and that means doing some work to map your supply chain. Understand, where some people don't even know where their main suppliers are based or where the products are being manufactured. So start with that. Then really start to understand, based on the geography and the supplier profile and the industry that you're purchasing different products or services from, what ESG or social issues are more likely to be prevalent. And to give an example, we actually did this on ourselves in the EY. I work with our EY global procurement team quite closely. So we looked at our supply chain. We have, obviously, like many of you, have 50,000 plus suppliers. So we need to start with a bit of a risk-based approach. So we looked at what we were buying to find that the hotspots for our social issues were found in certain categories, things like where we were buying EY merchandise that was being, importing cotton and being made in Southeast Asia. Also, the areas where we tend to see more forced labor and human trafficking is in a lot of sectors like cleaning and hospitality. So we looked for where there are certain geographies where those people were working within our supply chains. And that tells us where we need to focus our attention in terms of supplier engagement and outreach. So, we're not starting with just a blanket approach. And then, so I think I would say the first step is really know your supply chain, know where your risks and opportunities are. And then the second step is don't make this a sort of standalone process or anything like that, really embedded into how you think about procurement more generally. So it's adding a new layer to your traditional procurement criteria of price, quality, on-time delivery, and then sustainability or social issues as well. So that the way that you select and engage and monitor and audit a supplier should be as embedded as possible, so that it's all part of the same conversations.
Now, Lauren, you brought up a good point in terms of, and I think people don't realize it, but large companies like yourselves, United, have 50, 60,000 suppliers, or at least tier 2 suppliers within their supply chain. And it's impossible to go out and audit every one of them and know where every one of them's source of products came from. So yeah, risk-based approach is probably the best practices in terms of ferreting out the problems in the supply chain. I would like to move on, because we do have a limited amount of time, and just talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, which is a really big topic in the United States and slowly spreading to the rest of the world. Just to kind of frame it, diversity, you talk about what the composition of your workforce is. Equity is really about how those people in your workforce are treated and advanced within an organization and paid. And inclusion is how they feel about where they work and how they are accommodated by their beliefs or personal situations. So with that said, Ashima, how important is DEI for United when evaluating a company's purchasing decision?
Very important. And I don't know how many people know, but United Airlines has this tagline, "Good leads the way." And it is very important, especially in the last 1 year. It has been the top priority for our CEO. As far as purchasing decisions are concerned, we always start with saying that it is the right thing to do. That is what is the guidance from the CEO to all our leaders. And that's what United's commitment is. How we do it. So what we have done in the last couple of years is actually change the process, and exactly what Lauren was talking about. It has to be in the DNA of the organization, and culture flows from the top. So it is part of every EVP's, every bit of business division goals, and how you think about diversity, DEI, as far as supply chain is concerned. You have to RFP every product or service that you are buying. And then what is very important is track the rate of inclusion. Like, if not, why not? Why a diverse or a small supplier was not included in a particular RFP process? So that's important. And then having standard questions around DEI practices in your RFP process from all the candidates, the suppliers that are bidding on. Even if you choose to go ahead with a non-diverse supplier, then having a strong commitment from your non-diverse suppliers. What is their commitment to the overall cause as a company? Will they, if they do not have a DEI program as robust as United's, we set them to our standards, and if they do not have something, are they committed? Do they have the intent to or commit to making good faith efforts in doing or standing up a program like that? It's part of our contractual language, United standard contract templates. So, however, having said that, I would say once we ensure that there are small and diverse suppliers included in a RFP process, it's a leveled playing field for everyone. So we focus on inclusion a lot more. And then the selection process is all about the capabilities and being competitive in the process.
So just to kind of paraphrase, when you do your procurement process, you want to make sure that you have a diverse pool of companies to draw from. And then from there, it's equitable. It's whoever the best company is wins. But if they're not part of the process, they'll never get the procurement. So I think that's a great approach. Siobhan, how does DEI influence your investment process or selection, investment manager selection?
Yeah, so we had a couple of examples about 2 years ago, I'd say, where we sold a fund based on some of the things that Lauren was mentioning. It was, hospitality. They held a couple of companies in the hospitality sector. Those companies were franchises. They had absolutely no visibility on the workforce. And that really made us think, and there were a number of sort of controversies that came up with this hotel group, and it really made us rethink how the fund manager was looking at this. And that took us sort of on a journey internally to think, hold on, we need to be doing this in a much more formalized process. So really what Ashima was saying around, there's pockets of good practice here, but we really need to make this the overarching approach. So for us, what we ended up doing was a exercise using ILPA, which is the Limited Partners Association. So for private equity, despite us not having that large of a private equity holding, it was actually where we found huge amount of guidance and templates on different definitions, different standardized questions, as Ashima was saying, really making it easy for our fund managers to fill this out. And we went through to all of the fund managers and we said, okay, we need you to fill this out both at the fund level. So really, what are the different portfolio companies doing? But also we want to understand the diversity and inclusion practices at the fund manager level. And this is where we saw quite a big difference, I think, between fund managers that we had picked for sustainable reasons and fund managers that we had in our core universe, really sort of some of the older fund houses. And I think it's no secret that the financial industry has a way to go in terms of diversity and representation. But that exercise meant we started asking questions that some of them had never heard before. I mean, it wasn't just on gender diversity at the board level, which is something that they're very used to, but really drilling down into ethnicity, into some of the practices around promotion and retention. And all of a sudden, these questions are coming hard and fast. And I'm sure we're not the only ones asking these questions, but that then made it much easier for us to make decisions, because all of a sudden we have data available. We're able to compare. We're able to say, okay, what is the average? And sometimes we were quite surprised, and sometimes you just have outliers. So doing that has really made it a little bit easier for us to start creating behaviors around selecting new fund managers and engaging the current ones as well.
Now, I actually see that in practice, where managers now, by writing a DEI policy, start thinking about it, including it within their workforce recruitment. And the excuse that we can't find talent, it doesn't matter anymore, because they're able to build talent themselves, which is great to see. And it's very new, though. It's only been in the last couple of years. So I think over the years, things will get better. Lauren, how do you advise clients on DEI? But more importantly, do you see differences among regions with DEI? I mean, they can't all be the same.
Yeah.
US versus Europe versus Asia.
Definitely, especially, I mean, across the board, but I find that particularly when you're looking at supplier diversity as well, for two reasons. I think one, I'm originally from Australia, and, diversity there is, in terms of is really focused on the Indigenous communities compared to the US, where it's sort of BIPOC communities. And so each region will have pretty nuanced differences between what diversity means. And you have to sort of you really just have to work with the local teams that you have in the organization. That's the approach that we took as EY and that we recommend, so that you've got a global policy vision approach, and then it's executed with the differences within each region. Or area, and because in some cases as well, there's laws around what you can and can't ask and things like that. So you really have to be mindful of those differences, I think. But to answer your question in terms of how I think Ashima and Siobhan covered a lot of the sort of types of advice that we're providing. I think a couple of things. What I would, just to sort of summarize some of that, would be, we try to take a pretty holistic view in how we're thinking about it. And so making sure, I think, if you take an example of supplier diversity, a lot of companies sort of set their, 20% of our suppliers are going to be diverse, and then, kind of step away, and that's it. I think really the way we come in is to look at the holistic approach. Is there governance? Is there clear policies? Are you focused on the inclusion part as much as you are the diversity? Because even if you can attract the people into your organization, if you don't make them feel included, they're not going to stay, or they're not going to want to continue to work with you. So, really tackling it from and I think Ashima's point was great, that even if you can't engage diverse suppliers, really understanding that they have aligned values to you as well. So all those kinds of things is really just taking a holistic approach is how we do it. And then really, where you're getting stuck, try and unpack the reasons for that. And we see that a lot in procurement, where we're finding we can't get we can't meet our targets for diverse suppliers. And the reasons is because your procurement processes are too cumbersome for some of these smaller suppliers to deal with. So you might need to really look at your own business to see how can you, complicate some of that, or find new pipelines and things like that. So sort of root cause analysis and in advancing your mission as well.
Yeah, I think what Ashima does and United really fits that really well, by making that diverse group in the procurement process. I wish we could spend a lot more time on DEI. It's a great topic. I actually present that to my managers as a great recruitment tool in keeping your staff in a world of the great resignation. Having a strong DEI policy creates that stronger workforce. A lot of people don't get that. So there is the value added, and to Siobhan's comment, not understanding your workforce and who you invest in is that means that you don't know who you're investing in, because every company says the value of their company comes from their people. And if you don't know who their people are, then you really don't know the value of that company. We need to move on, because we have, again, only an hour on a lot of topics. So I want to talk about human rights and other social issues that affect company purchases. Now, human rights is a big issue that's, again, overlooked oftentimes in the media for a lot of different reasons. But I'd like to get into Siobhan. How do you consider other S topics when evaluating companies in supply chain? And maybe you have an example or two of where it might make a difference.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So we've thought about this for a while, and we decided to look at it from a salience approach. So we really thought, okay, what are the worst offenses? And we view this as human rights needs to be almost like an umbrella approach above other social issues, making sure that we're sort of maintaining those minimum safeguards. So we look at human rights as the first point, and it's very easy to think that human rights is an emerging markets issue and not a developed markets issue. It is both. We've had a couple of different incidents. We love renewable energy. I think everyone does. It's the investment topic of the next decade. But with that comes, as you mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, a lot of critical minerals, and that involves the mining industry, and it involves solar panels being put together in certain regions in China where we know there's forced labor, for example. So we've been working with certain companies and certain fund managers to think about, okay, well, how do we look after people, and how do we not just eliminate whole sectors and make sure that we look after people? So for us, one of our solar panel companies does operate using Uyghur labor. However, we were really pleased that they were able to report that, and what they had decided to do was using sort of actual Chinese boots on the ground, do an exercise where they were looking at worker contracts, so the language, the contract terms, and also cross-referencing home addresses for those workers. We can then look at where the workers are linked and cross-reference that with things like detention centers. I mean, these are really serious issues, but to us, it meant that they had a much better view of what their workforce looked like than other suppliers that we had, knowing they operated in the same region, telling us, no, we don't use any Uyghur labor at all. So that was one of the examples that we had based in China. In the US, however, we had a home goods and DIY company come up recently that was linked to using forced prison labor. And that was, again, something where we felt, hold on, this is not just, and we can talk about the textiles in the UK. I'm not saying it's not a UK issue, but this is certainly not something that is sort of isolated in emerging markets. So human rights is really important to us. It's that top barrier that we need to make sure is being looked after. And then underneath that, we do, of course, consider diversity and inclusion, but the other element is that decent work bit. And that's really thinking a little bit about things like paid time off, things like sick leave, which was a really big issue just after COVID-19, and things like maternity and paternity policies. So that's one of the ones I think in the US, you do so much better than we do in the UK on actually getting diversity traits. But we are maybe a little bit better on the maternity and paternity leave because we have that sort of as a national policy, and then companies try and go above and beyond that. So really starting to look at what are the things, as you mentioned, Joe, that really do help retain talent and also attract talent as well.
All right, interesting. Lauren, from the UK standpoint, they have the UK Modern Day Slave Act. How important is it for companies to comply with that are located in the UK? And tell us a little about it as well.
Yeah, well, I think to take a big step back, I think Siobhan summed it up well, that human rights sits for me and a lot of people above everything else in the sustainability realm as an important issue, because so many of the infringements on human rights are so egregious and irremediable. So, you can't give a child back their childhood if they were engaged in forced labor. So, I think from the standpoint of why should companies comply, I think it's because of that, just the importance of this issue, and and that there's this sort of tendency for companies to think it's not in my supply chain. Most of my suppliers are coming from US, but as Siobhan said, we see it all the time. So I think in terms of the why, that's why it's important. And then certain companies will still be caught by legislation in different jurisdictions if they meet revenue or employee level thresholds, which many do. And I think, Siobhan laid out the plethora of regulation that's emerging. You're going to be caught likely by one of those. So the best approach is to make sure you have a program that covers off the expectations of all of them, to make sure you're compliant with that regulation, for compliance purposes, to avoid getting fined, but probably more so to avoid not doing the right thing, or to avoid getting in the papers, because that will happen too.
Yeah, I guess it's an economic effect if you have a lot of bad press.
Yeah.
So Ashima, on with United, first of all, I don't think of United of having a human rights issue, because what could United possibly be purchasing that would involve slave labor, since they're not purchasing textiles, they're not purchasing lithium batteries to a large extent. So can you tell us, like, how is human rights, factored into the purchasing decision, and what are you actually purchasing that's high risk?
So it's not a big part of our spend, as you said, but there are things that we buy globally. For example, as far as textiles is concerned, uniforms, our crew uniforms, pilots and flight attendants. That's like our uniform suppliers. We make sure there are standard clauses in our contracts, and we do supplier audits as well, which are around labor standards. So no child labor or human trafficking, forced labor is involved in things like in manufacturing of the uniforms. We buy food locally. We fly to over 200 cities across the world, and the onboard food or the onboard amenity kits that that everybody receives in the first and business class, they come from all parts of the world. Crew hotels. So our crew, our pilots and flight attendants, they stay at hotels across the world. So we do site inspections every year in all the hotels to make sure that all our labor standards are followed. So those are some of the examples of what we buy. And then corporate real estate buys furniture, carpets all the time. So we make sure that the carpet manufacturing, wherever it's coming from in the supply chain, it had the right labor standards, and the environmental sustainability questions become like a much bigger weightage in the RFP process, in things like that we buy. But yeah, I mean, I don't think so. It's a big factor when we look at aircraft parts and buying the fleet and the engine parts. So, but yeah, all those are the things that I don't.
All right, yeah, and I guess it highlights the fact that you just never know where it is in your supply chain. And I would never think of the hotels where the people are staying at all over the world, and whether they're, humane.
That's a good spend for us.
Yeah, I would think so. It's a good spend for a lot of companies. So before I move on, there's one more question I really do want to ask Lauren, and that is, do you really think multinational companies are really able to audit their tier 2 suppliers? And the tier 2 supplier, for the people on the line, are the companies not you're buying from, but the companies that your companies are buying from. So just quickly, what do you think about their ability to do that? Or is it really happening?
It is really happening. I think it's hard. I think this is a journey, and it takes a few years to get into those tiers. You have to start with your tier 1 suppliers. But I do think, I mean, Ashima talked about her approach, which is to really cascade your expectations of your tier 1s onto your tier 2s. And then I've seen companies do, really good jobs of then making sure that the audits, where the risk is high, that they're doing audits of those tier 2 suppliers as well, or really, effective traceability of really mapping out those suppliers, and so you can engage with them directly. But I'm not going to say it's easy. It's a real challenge, and you have to really just work on this really closely with your tier 1 suppliers, I think.
Yeah, no, it's when you have 50,000 suppliers who probably have another 50,000 suppliers, you can see it's a very daunting task.
Yep.
So yeah, I agree. It's something out there.
And you're only saying tier 2. It usually goes down to more like 6 and 7.
No, we're not going to go there at all. So remember, by the way, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or put it in the chat, because we only have another 20 minutes left of the presentation. I want to go on to, though, one more area, which is sustainability. It's an important area to consider. as much as human rights. I think human rights should be number one because, yeah, you can't do anything about that. You want a diverse workforce and you want a sustainable supply chain. So Ashima, how does United consider sustainability objectives within their supply chain? Or your supply chain?
That's, yeah, our sustainability journey. We started on that journey on a proactive basis only in the last year and a half. And right now, I would say compared to DEI, human rights, we are a little at a nascent stage. But what we have definitely made sure is that we have a very a standard questionnaire with a lot of training involved for all the category managers for our RFP, to run our RFP processes. And we are not there as far as having it as a commitment in the contracts yet. And that is something we are actively working with our ESG team. So what should we contractually bind all our suppliers to commit to? Because that's a very, sustainability becomes a very large topic, and it's very hard to get to a standard language that caters to all types of contracts that we have. But definitely the intent is there, and therefore it has been incorporated in our RFP processes.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I realize
in our overall RFP processes, like it all gets into incorporating it into the DNA of the organization.
so. I imagine your suppliers love your long contracts.
Yeah, they do complain also about our long contract.
Right, but this goes to the beginning of what I said is the importance of suppliers to understand their customers' demands. And if by implementing these types of policies and procedures, you look much better to companies like United.
Yeah.
And you make better investments for Siobhan's company. So
yeah, and when you put these things in the contract, it gives a very strong message about the intent of a company as large as United Airlines. And we like to be leaders in initiatives like these. And that's how I would imagine all other companies in the supply chain will follow.
now during our earlier session when we were talking about this, I do want to ask Lauren a question because she wrote something in her notes and I found that interesting. We have to talk something about the environment for sustainability. And you mentioned there's changes to the traditional carbon measurements beyond scope 1 and 2. What do you mean by that? That's pretty, we're just trying to learn 1 and 2 now.
Well, I don't know exactly what I meant. I think, but probably was probably talking about the fact that I don't think there's been a change of measurements that's remained pretty standard for years with the greenhouse gas protocol. But the focus on scope 3 emissions is really what has changed in the last couple of years, because most companies got their scope 1 and 2. For those that don't know, that's your the emissions that are coming from your own operations, to really looking to their supply chains, which is the scope 3. And that's really where for most companies, like 70, 80, 90+% of your overall impact is likely to sit for many companies. And so, I think it's an extremely difficult area to tackle if you're trying to get good data from your suppliers on what kind of emissions they are emitting as a result of providing you with products or services, and then working with them to try and reduce those emissions. But that's the work that's underway because of the many great and ambitious net zero targets that companies have set. So I think it's really just, I think this shift into really looking at the scope 3 and all the things we've discussed is the way that it's done. Same kind of things, embedding it into contracts and procurement processes in supplier engagement. But it's a big job to try and work with your suppliers to get them to commit to meaningful targets as well, and come with you on this journey.
Yeah, I don't want to get too into it because that's a whole nother hour presentation on reporting greenhouse gases, and even getting into there's a scope 4 now that I've been reading about. It's like just when we thought you learned 3.
If I can just say, Joe, I think this is something that's really important for any companies on the line. This is now the focus of our AGM seasons. So me as an investor, more and more shareholders are submitting proposals at AGM seasons asking the companies to include scope 3. whether it's on climate or, I mean, this year we've seen a couple of big resolutions at consumer good companies on deforestation and biodiversity. So investors are really starting to sort of push companies on their supply chains, and it's making its way up to management level at AGM. So definitely not something to sort of forget.
No, and people have to remember, investors are the owners of the companies, and they're able to push the companies to reporting this information. I know the EU taxonomy, SFDR, which are specific rules to the EU, are requiring the collection of emissions data for scope 1, 2, and 3. There's the ISSB, which is another acronym. It's an alphabet city of ESG, but which is requiring or asking for disclosure in financial statements. The SEC is going to be publishing probably in April or May rules for the disclosure of emissions data in financial statements. For all the people that say it's not material or is material, I like to think of emissions data as almost like a calorie account. When people buy something, they want to see how many calories or what the emissions are, the products that they're buying. And I also remind the companies that emissions cost money to create. So if you want to create a lot of emissions, you're probably spending a lot more money as well. We do have a question in the chat. I'm not quite sure the measurement systems that Lisa asked on this, but if she wants to share, or just in what category is it DEI, which is has its own problems in measuring human rights. I don't think there is one. From a supplier system, are there databases out there that rate suppliers from a human rights or DEI standpoint?
There's a huge range of them. So yeah, Lisa's just shared a couple of the examples. There's Supplier AO, for example, will help you with getting a handle on how many of your suppliers are diverse suppliers, so that you don't have to kind of do those processes manually. And then most of the big sort of IT providers as well and systems providers are now implementing or have already implemented sort of ESG modules to help you with collecting the various sustainability data. We're a bit technology agnostic at EY, but I think what is important is that you sort of go through a process to find the one that's most suited to your needs, and as much as you can, link it into your existing ERP and other systems. Maybe Ashima has some thoughts there, but
yeah.
I think
I can add to how for supplier diversity, we definitely use a third party to validate all our information. However, we have learned over the last 2 years that even all the third parties do not have the right data, and it changes on a quarterly basis. It actually changes very frequently because of all the M&A activity, etc., that happens from time to time. And you could always have ownership changes for any company. We have heavily invested in our internal tools, and we will soon be requiring, we'll go live with the new system where we'll be requiring all our suppliers to submit their certificates, etc., of their ownership status or size status using NEX codes, etc., and registering within a united pool. So we want to have more ownership on that information, and it will be on the suppliers to keep that information always current and relevant.
Now, I think it's transparency is really what's everyone's looking for in terms of who they're working with, who they're associating their company with and spending on. So I think that's important. Lauren, what do you think, just on transparency, do you think CPA firms or accounting firms can have a role in terms of providing transparency on companies?
Yeah, I mean, from an audit standpoint, absolutely. I did my first greenhouse gas assurance in 2008. So we've been doing this a long time, but it's been mostly voluntary. And I think what's shifting is with the SEC rule and other regulation is it's pushed the ownership of ESG data or sustainability data from just the sort of CSO or sustainability team into the finance team as well. And so that's where, now even on a voluntary basis, but going forward on a regulatory basis, companies want to have more sort of certainty on the data that they're reporting than they were probably comfortable with before. So our sort of sustainability assurance practice has, exploded as a result of that. Just really with companies looking for making sure that the data that it's putting out is investor grade. And then, alongside that, a lot of the work we do is sort of helping to think through what that, like building the processes and controls to do that. So I imagine, all the companies here are sort of having thoughts around this as they're just strengthening up those processes to make sure that the audit committees and the board are comfortable with that information going out into mainstream disclosures.
I think the third party validation is really important. And the problem with some of these databases is that it's just self-serving data. Doing certain reviews of M&A transactions, you see that the management doesn't care about it as much, and they overstate what they've actually are doing. I think Ashima, you probably see a lot of that. So I have a question in terms of, while we're waiting, if anyone does have more questions, please ask. But in our last few minutes, Siobhan, do you think deploying a DEI or considering social responsibility in the investment process, does it affect your returns at all?
It's a great question, and it's one that I wish you would have asked me a year ago. The last year has been really tough for sustainable investors, I think, from a performance perspective, because many of the companies we invest in are growth companies. They've really been hit by inflationary pressures. Without sort of pushing ourselves, we have been looking at sort of sustainable value companies to try and combat that. But in terms of diversity and inclusion, the teams have much longer term perspectives. We see that they're, combating risk a lot more. They're much more aware. We have a number of fund managers that are sort of emerging market experts, and they've really been able to find opportunities even in sort of harder times. So definitely it's something that we really look for, and it's definitely something that we think will drive outperformance. I have to sort of, give a big caveat just on the last year, but before that, for the 3 years before, our sustainable funds were outperforming all of our core funds. So it's definitely something that we think, we have 25% more female fund managers in our sustainably managed funds than core. So, it's definitely something that we think is bringing a lot of value to our clients.
No, I think so as well. And I think it also probably brings a lot of value to United, having a diverse workforce in its own population, not just the suppliers, but its own company. All right, well, we're kind of coming to the very end of it. Does anyone have questions before I ask our speakers to have some final thoughts? If not, Ashima, do you want to share some final thoughts on what we've spoken about today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for United Airlines, we are an airline. We definitely burn a lot of jet fuel. So we are very conscious of all our efforts related to all ESG initiatives. Especially in the last 2 years, we have had very good focus on DEI, and what we have internally stood up are 4 pillars. It's around the customers, around the suppliers, community, and employees. So those are the 4 pillars that we are working towards. I primarily align with the supplier diversity pillar, and this was a good meeting for me to learn about what a wealth management company thinks and how Ernst & Young is participating in all these initiatives. Yeah, good leads the way.
Okay, thank you. Siobhan, do you have some thoughts?
I think just sharing that it's work in progress for everyone, and it'll keep evolving that way. We certainly don't think we're good and that's it. And I guess a call for all of the companies and their suppliers just on more transparency and more disclosure so that we're able to get the right data and make decisions on that.
Okay, very good. And Lauren,
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I think a collaborative approach as well. I think there can be a tendency to think I'll just put it together a policy and demand things of my suppliers that they can so that they can do this. And in my experience, that hasn't worked as well as providing a little bit more education on like why this is important and bringing them along in the journey, and having you know, a little bit of stick but more carrot to incentivize suppliers to partake in this with you.
Yeah, that's good. For myself, my final thoughts on what we've talked about, or the takeaway that I think everyone should have, is one, understand that what we spoke about is a real value proposition to companies that work with multinationals or larger corporations to incorporate value-based hiring practices and operations. It'll put you on the map for companies like United, or you wouldn't even be included in the procurement process without them. And if you look at companies that do the investing, who are the owners of these companies, they look to this as well. So it's really important for companies to do that. It also makes you a better company because you'll have less turnover. And as Siobhan might have mentioned, the sustainable investment, they were up, but they're up probably because they have less turnover and they focus investing long-term on better companies. And just because sustainable investments are down 1 year, that's a very short-term view, since sustainability is supposed to mean us providing the next generation with what we have today. So our next generation isn't next year, it's 25 years from now. So with that, I'd like to turn this back over to Tamara, who can close us out.
Thank you, Joe, Ashima, Siobhan, Lauren. That was really fantastic, I think, and kind of specific and helpful with the examples that you gave. So thank you for that. Thanks to all of you for joining. I'm not sure if my team answered. There was a question in the chat about a recording. I believe we are recording this and we'll be sharing that. So we'll follow up with that information. The next event that we'll do in a similar format is on February 23rd, talking about the rise of the Chief Purpose Officer in organizations. And I'm sure there is some nexus to a lot of the points that we covered in this conversation today. So I hope everyone can join us for that. Thank you all again for joining. Thank you to our speakers and our members, and see you soon.